very much. It's nice of all you to have me here. Oh, I'm sorry. Sometimes I forget where I am. Actually, that comes from listening to so many tape recordings of organized crime people who actually do talk like that. Marlon Brando spent a long time and got their accents just right. It's also very nice of you to have me for lunch. I should tell you that since I became United States Attorney, not many of my friends have lunch with me in restaurants in New York anymore. I don't know why that is, but so I guess I have to go out of town in order to have lunch with people. Sometimes I'm compared in New York. There are debates, some favorably, some unfavorably, with a predecessor of mine who goes back about 50 years, and that's Thomas E. Dewey, Tom Dewey. The last time I mentioned this at a college campus to the students, they didn't know who I was talking about. So I should tell you that he used to be United States Attorney and District Attorney, and he was a governor in New York and a presidential candidate on several occasions. And there's a debate that goes on in a legal journal in New York about whether I've convicted more people, corrupt politicians, organized crime figures, than he did, or fewer, and the significance of it. And it really is a kind of a silly academic debate, but it engages some people's interest. So I decided I had to find something funny to say about Tom Dewey. And I did research on this, and this was not easy, but I found one story about him that maybe is funny. We'll find out. I'm going to tell you the story. It comes from a book of anecdotes. This is not my own story. I don't want to claim that I'm plagiarizing this. This comes from a book of anecdotes. But it goes something like this. On the evening of the 1948 election returns, when the returns were going to be counted and tabulated, he had dinner with his wife all alone in their hotel suite before they went down and joined all their friends to watch the returns. And toward the conclusion of dinner, he leaned over to her, quite confident that he was going to be elected the next president against Harry Truman. He leaned over to her and he said, "Tomorrow evening, my dear, you will be sleeping with the next president of the United States. Isn't that exciting?" And she, this is the era before Gary Hart, so this was not a particularly... This is not a particularly provocative statement. So she said to him, "Oh yes, it will be, Tom. It'll be very exciting." So they went downstairs, they watched the returns. The evening was over, and he was again quite confident he was going to be elected. In fact, the Chicago Tribune had a headline that said, "Dewey defeats Truman." So they both went to sleep quite confident as to the person with whom she'd be sleeping the next night. In the morning, they were awakened in their hotel suite. The woman came in with a newspaper. The newspaper made it quite clear that Truman had indeed defeated Dewey. She saw it first, and then displaying probably a better sense of humor than he had, she handed him the newspaper and very quickly said to him, "Should I call Harry Truman, or should I wait for Harry to call me?" America in 1988 obviously is in a period and at a time when we're going to be making choices that have a great deal to do with our future and how we go into the next century, positively, negatively, or somewhere in between. The thing that I spend and have spent the last 4.5 years of my life dealing with primarily is the problem of crime, whether it's organized crime or drug dealing or white-collar crime or crime committed by people in government. And I must say, it's a pretty sorry picture that I see of where we are in 1988. I don't think it's a necessarily frustrating kind of situation. I think it's something we can do something about or not, but it really is there for us to make a choice about and not just to submit to and to watch and to continue to watch it get worse and worse and worse. I think it's incumbent upon all of us, particularly now in a presidential election year, to take a look at how are we going to approach the future, and what new challenges are we going to take on, and how are we going to improve our society. We can't leave it just to presidential candidates and people who fancy themselves political operatives and leaders to chart this course. All of us have to be concerned about it. And I'm very concerned about it for two interrelated reasons: the problem of crime and the problem of drugs. because I see those problems as problems affecting not just the area that I deal with, which is in New York City and has some ramifications for the nation and the world, but I see very similar problems all over the United States. When I was Associate Attorney General, I had the privilege of traveling throughout this country and meeting with citizens groups and law enforcement groups, mostly about the problem of crime and about the problem of drugs. And if there's one problem that was listed as the major priority in almost every community that I went to, whether it was Wyoming or Miami, New York or South Dakota, the problem was the problem of drugs, affecting all of these communities in different ways, but affecting them and affecting mostly the young people and the children in those communities. And it's something we're going to have to face up to, and it's something we're going to have to do something about. Let me first sketch out a little bit of the problem so I make myself clear about the level of the problem. And then let me talk about some of the things that we can do, short-term and long-term, to turn the problem around. Because I don't like, and I don't think you like, dwelling too long on a problem without our talking about some positive things that can be done to turn that problem around. Because every problem is an opportunity for change and an opportunity to make things better. Americans murder each other and commit violent crimes against each other at rates 10 and 20 times more than other countries with which we would want to compare ourselves. England, France, Germany, Italy, Japan. We violate and harm each other at alarming rates, much greater than the societies from which much of our culture and civilization emerged, and the nations with which we would want to compare ourselves in the sense of democracies and decent, civilized, cultured nations. That's alarming and very disturbing. But 10 years ago, we probably knew that. What we didn't know 10 years ago is that the problem of crime goes beyond violent crime. It goes beyond just crime committed by poor people against poor people, by people at the lower end of the socioeconomic ladder. What we found out in the last decade, maybe the last 4 or 5 years, is that crime is unfortunately a proportionate problem, that it affects the middle levels of our society and the upper levels of our society. The problem of drugs certainly indicates that. Americans spend in excess of $100 billion a year on drugs. $100 billion a year on drugs. That is an incredible amount of money, and it creates an incredible problem in our society. And it drives the problem to a very, very large extent. No matter what we do in law enforcement, no matter what the government can do with regard to foreign policy and the borders of the United States, and I think there is a lot that can be done, and I'll talk about that, and a lot more can be done. But no matter how well that's done, if so many American citizens vote with their dollars for heroin and cocaine and marijuana, it is always going to be an impossible problem to deal with. We are only going to turn that problem around when we begin to substantially cut into and reduce the demand for drugs. Or put another way, if we were to do all of the right things, and all of the things that you and I can agree on that the government should be doing in foreign policy and at the border and in imprisoning people who deal drugs and use drugs, if we were to do all of that, but we were still spending $100 billion or anything near that amount on drugs, somebody would find a way to satisfy that demand because the lure of profit is so great. And the only way we're going to make substantial long-term inroads in that problem is to dramatically bring down the demand. The picture is not much better in the areas of organized crime, corruption in government, financial crime, and let me again just very briefly sketch those problems. In my city, we deal with 5 mafia organized crime families and 25 other organized crime groups, whether they're Colombian cocaine operatives or people from other different kinds of groups that are involved in heroin and cocaine and labor racketeering and extortion. And we have tolerated that level of organized crime decade after decade after decade after decade. We are now, in the last 4 or 5 years, finally, we haven't won the battle yet, but we have won some major victories in dealing with them for the first time. We've put substantial numbers of them in prison, much more so than ever before, and we've begun taking their money and their power away from them, taking unions back from them, taking businesses back from them, and taking their real source of power, their money, away from them. So that we haven't won, but we're certainly on the right road. But it is a substantial problem. When I became United States Attorney in mid-1983, we had no program in the United States Attorney's Office for dealing with the problem of corruption in government. We used to have a special unit that investigated people who held public office where there were allegations of corruption. We had disbanded it, I guess on the assumption that New York City and our region is free of corrupt public officials. I reestablished that unit, and in the last 4.5 years, we've convicted over 150 people of the crime of bribery and related crimes. Some people who, several years ago, were the most powerful political officials in my city and in my state, and some people that were powerful officials not only at the local and state level, but also at the federal level. But it isn't just at the top. Let me give you one example of an investigation that, for me, was the most frustrating and the one that was probably the most disappointing from the point of view of the public situation and the public good. Several years ago, based on investigatory work that the FBI and my office were doing together, we were able to convince a businessman, because we caught him in a crime, to permit us to take an undercover FBI agent, place him in his business, and act as an undercover agent going around the state dealing with public officials who purchased materials for cities and towns and villages and counties. Over a course of 2.5 years, this FBI agent offered bribes in this undercover operation on 106 occasions to public officials in the state of New York. On 105 of the 106 occasions, the public official willingly, gladly, and quickly accepted the bribe. There were times in which the FBI agent had difficulty getting the money out of his pocket before the public official's hand was on his hand, taking the money away from him. On one occasion, a public official turned down the bribe. This is in a 2.5-year period. 57 different people, one occasion. That public official turned down the bribe, not because it was wrong, not because it was illegal or immoral, not even because he was frightened that he'd be caught. He turned it down because it wasn't enough money. That public official was convicted a month ago of the crime of bribery because he took bribes in other situations. It was a very, very disturbing investigation to me, to all of the FBI agents who worked on it, and to the assistant United States attorneys, because in a narrow way, you could say we were successful. We have arrested 57 people. We have convicted now 45 or 46 of them. No one has been acquitted. There are still some cases that remain, but it's been a very successful investigation if you look at things in a very narrow sense. But it's been a very unsuccessful investigation in the sense of what it tells us about the nature of, or the state of, the way in which we practice politics in New York City and New York State. And we're not alone. The investigation I described to you is no different than 4 or 5 other investigations conducted by a United States attorney in Mississippi, or I go state by state, in which very similar things were found in the way people in government regard the oath of office that they take as something that can be turned in for profit. And then let's look for a moment at the area of financial crime. Tax evasion, trading on inside information, securities fraud, all of those areas. Back in 1983, when I first began as the United States Attorney, we investigated and prosecuted an individual named Mark Rich and a number of his companies for a tax evasion scheme, which over a period of time, 2.5, 3-year period, resulted in his evading about $90 million to $100 million in taxes. To me, it was an astounding case. I had never heard of a $90 million tax evasion case, and I had been an assistant United States attorney before in New York, and that I prosecuted a lot of white-collar crimes and saw $10 million frauds and $20 million, but $90 million or $100 million. It was the largest case in the history of the United States. We recovered $200 million, and we were very proud of ourselves. We thought we had done a wonderful job. That $90 million case was followed very shortly by another tax evasion case in which the amount was $150 million of taxes evaded, and then by another one that involved $400 million and then recently a case known as the Atkins case, in which the individuals were just convicted, involving over $1 billion, but just a small group of people, of taxes evaded, and we've just indicted someone for $800 million in tax evasion. I can tell you quite confidently that if Americans would stop illegally evading the payment of taxes, the deficit problem that we worry about would be a very small problem, because we're talking about $100 billion or more in taxes that are illegally evaded and not paid, not avoided, not artfully avoided, or where loopholes are utilized that you might argue about but are available. But I'm talking about people who fail to report income, people who use schemes that are intended to criminally deprive the United States of revenue. And it's an amount of money that has an effect on how we conduct the national defense of the United States and how we take care of our other domestic priorities. We just don't understand it that way. We understand the dangers of murder, rape, mugging. We don't understand the tremendous burdens that are imposed on us by high-level swindlers and criminals who make it impossible for the government to make realistic choices about our defense and about dealing with some of the social problems that are important to all of us. And let me just conclude this part of it by mentioning the crime of insider trading and securities fraud. Until January 1 of 1984, there had been 12 people that had been convicted in the United States, in the history of the United States, over a 50-year period of the crime of insider trading. None of those people went to prison, 12 in 50 years. Since January 1 of 1984, we have convicted 46 people of that crime. That's in just that very short period of time, 46 people. And I think that tells part of the problem and part of the road to solving the problem. The Congress had imposed criminal penalties for people trading on inside information, which means people who sit in very high positions in corporations, or lawyers working for those corporations or investment bankers who receive information in their professional capacity, who then take that information and rather than using it for that purpose, use it for the purpose of trading secretly for themselves, their relatives, their friends, their co-conspirators, and in essence deprive individuals on the other side of that transaction of that information and profit to the extent of not just thousands or millions, but sometimes as much as $100 million or more, because we've had cases that have gotten up to that level. We were not, as a government, enforcing the penalties seriously against insider trading for a very long period of time. And the temptations that existed to make money quickly and to cheat others was so great, and at the other end of it there was no deterrent to engaging in this kind of conduct. One of the things that we are going to have to do with white-collar crime, violent crime, drug dealing, is begin to change the risk factor analysis. And let me tell you from my experience, listening, literally listening without joking about it, to thousands and thousands of hours of criminals talking to each other based on FBI wiretaps and surveillances, not just organized criminals, but corrupt political officials and corrupt businessmen. All of them do a risk analysis in one way or another. And here's what I mean. They evaluate the profit that they're going to make, the amount of money they can make from the bribe, from the tax scheme, from the fraud, against the chance of being caught, and then the punishment they will receive if they are caught. They sometimes evaluate that quite precisely in conversations that I could play for you. And even when they don't do it precisely, it is part of the if not subconscious, almost conscious thought process of a white-collar criminal. And drug dealers and many of the people that you would not consider to be white-collar criminals are. They commit crimes for profit. By and large, they do not believe that they're going to be caught. They rely on a criminal justice system that, even if they are caught, gives them a lot more benefits than any other system in the world or in the history of the world. And then they rely on the fact that they may not have to go to prison at the end of all that. We have to subtly, but I think quite effectively, change that risk analysis. We have to change it for drug dealers, for swindlers, for corrupt public officials, and the way we have to change it is the way we change the numbers with regard to insider trading, and maybe even more dramatically than that. They just can't be 12 in 50 years. We have to present these people who cannot be persuaded any other way with numerous examples of people who commit those crimes being caught and going to prison. That's what we have to do in the short term. And then I think we have to do something even more important in the long term. We have to aim for a period of time, 10 years from now, or 15 years from now, or 20 years from now, where we don't have to rely as much on the fear of being imprisoned as a way to convince people to obey the law. Because that's the way toward a healthier America, an America that will lead into the next century in a much healthier position than we are in today. There should be, in the year 2000 or the year 2010, significantly fewer people that have to be persuaded to obey the law because they are afraid that the FBI or a United States attorney or a district attorney is going to prosecute them and put them in prison. And significantly more people that understand internally why you should obey the law. Now, how do we do that? And how did we get to this situation at this stage in development in America? There are a lot of reasons, and we could debate them and we could discuss them, but let me give you what I think is the primary reason. We forgot how to teach ethics in American education. Actually, we didn't just forget how to teach ethics, we made a choice not to do it. 20 years ago and 30 years ago and all through the last 2 or 3 decades, because we confused two things. We confused the teaching of religion with the teaching of ethics. And we have, as you know, a big constitutional debate about the teaching of religion, which we could discuss and talk about. But the teaching of religion has nothing to do with the teaching of ethics. And we went dramatically, wildly, and I think somewhat imprudently in the direction of a valueless form of education broadly in the United States. We were afraid to teach things that are absolutely right, absolutely wrong. We were afraid to make moral and ethical distinctions between various ways of acting. And we presented the picture broadly that anything is arguable, that America is really not very different than the Soviet Union, that we may be practically different, but that morally and ethically we're really no different. We were afraid to say, this is wrong, this is right, this is evil, this is good. And we were afraid to do it in subtle ways and in broad ways. And it's really tragic because, in fact, we are now reaping what we sowed 5, 10, 15, and 20 years ago. And let me explain to you how we did it with one specific concrete example, the drug problem. When I talk about the drug problem or hear people talking about it, I sometimes get the impression that many people think that this massive problem of addiction in the United States is something that has been visited on us like a plague by an unfriendly supernatural force. Now, stand back from it, you know that that isn't the case. The drug problem that we have is a social problem. We created it, our society created it. And we created it 5 and 10 and 15 and 20 years ago in what we taught people. We created it in the movies and the music that we observed. We created it in the role models and the signals and the things that we were telling young people 5, 10, 15, and 20 years ago. Dr. Leary is only a decade ago. And Dr. Leary wasn't alone as a role model who professed all of the good things that could come from using marijuana and cocaine. I can remember 5 years ago debating and reading about how cocaine really was not a dangerous drug. I knew, because I was a prosecutor and was involved in drug rehabilitation, that cocaine was a devastating drug, as addictive or more addictive than heroin. But what I was reading and what I was hearing respected professionals say was that it really wasn't a very dangerous drug, even though I knew that it claimed millions of human lives over the last 20 years. We have got to change that. We've got to turn that around. And the best way to turn it around is to do the right way all the things that we did the wrong way 5, 10, and 15 years ago. To use all the ways in which we educate people, to educate them to the notion that the use of drugs is dangerous, it is harmful, it is not a particularly sensible thing to do, because we were sending all of the wrong messages. And that's the only way in which long-term we are going to affect the use of drugs. It's also long-term the only way we're going to inculcate in people the notion that you must obey the law, because that's part of the social contract that decent people make with each other. You go back to the earliest democracy, and we can learn something from it. The earliest democracy in Athens. One of the 4 crucial subjects that a young Athenian learned, along with mathematics and reading, was the subject of ethics. As a child, an Athenian was taught ethics, was taught to discuss and distinguish between what was right and wrong, was taught what the obligations are of a citizen in Athens to the government, to democracy, to participate, to become knowledgeable, so it is not unknowing and useless participation, but meaningful participation. Socrates walked around Athens conducting dialogues, not with the old people of Athens, not with the college level students of Athens, but with the young men of Athens. Because the Greeks understood that for a democracy to work, above and beyond everything else, people have to understand the difference between right and wrong, and they have to internalize their obligations to the government. A couple of weeks ago, U.S. News and World Report had a column that was written by a physician who I don't know. His name is Keith Ablow. And I'm going to read you just a small portion of it, because I think it sets the tone and very much the challenge that exists for us right now in 1988. Because all of these revelations of crime and criminal behavior and drug problems can either leave us wallowing in our misery, or they can challenge us to change things and to do things differently in the future, including the way in which we educate our young people. Now, let me quote now. If the spring of idealism and creativity in this country fails to revive, it will not be because 1 or 2 or 3 or more politicians disappoint us. It will be because we disappoint ourselves, maybe without even knowing it, maybe without caring, and continue to lose pride in the kind of people we are. 30 or 40 or 50 years from now, Americans will be looking back on us, some of them our children and our grandchildren, and they're going to look at this era that we lived in, and what are they going to say about it? Are they going to say that this was an era in which crime and greed and bribery and corruption predominated, and we didn't do much about it? We just continued along in that direction because we felt overwhelmed by our problems. Or are they going to look at us and say that we stood up to the problem, that we changed those things that had to be changed, that we changed the way in which we educate young people, the way in which we deal with problems of families, and we change the basic core values of our society? Well, I hope they say the second about us, and you do, but it isn't going to happen out of any kind of Marxist inevitability, because there is no such thing. It's going to happen if we take control of what's going on and change it. Remember, and sometimes we get very confused about this, that in a country like ours, changes occur from the bottom up, not from the top down. In a totalitarian government, in a communist government, the directorate of some social policy can direct the changes that take place in that society. It doesn't mean very much, but it can be done. In a society like ours, the people have to change the way they look at things and the way they feel about things and what they demand of their public officials and what they demand of themselves. And that's what we all have to do. It's not just for the presidential candidates. It's not just for people who run for public office. It's for all of us. And let me conclude by making 1 or 2 practical observations and then take your questions. There's a big debate going on among all of the presidential candidates. What I ask you to do is to listen to those that talk about the problem of drugs and talk about the problem of crime and talk about some of these things that will have more to do with the future of America than many of the frivolous issues that sometimes we spend an awful lot of time discussing. What we need to find is a way to move toward the future based on the things that have worked in America so that we can solve our problems based on those things that are right about us and that have made us strong in the past. We do not have to constantly be looking to the past or wallowing in all of these problems as if they cannot be solved. Let me stop now and take your questions, because I would like to hear your questions.